Realistically, in a review this dense, there is absolutely no way not to introduce spoilers, so if you don't want to know anything about Xenoblade 3, then don't watch this video. If you've already completed it, you're going to enjoy this. And if you don't mind me covering things like factions, character types, and the world setup, then yeah, you'll be fine. This review has literally been years in the making. Anyone who's watched the channel knows I've been playing this game since it came out. With most games, I would have just given up eventually and it would have become part of my permanent backlog. And despite a severe lack of time, there was something about Xenoblade Chronicles 3 that just kept bringing me back. It has an incredible cast of characters and a storyline that's not only easy to understand, but it doesn't rely on previous knowledge of the series. It wasn't just the characters though, it was the world they'd built here. It probably won't surprise you then that over half of the team at Monolith Soft are actually artists. I think the other 49% are wizards. It's time for something a little bit meatier. Why? Well, let's find out. I want to break the aspects down that make up this game into their key things, so we'll start off with the characters because that's where the heart is. The main protagonist is called Noah. He's a Kevesi Offseer. The Kevesi are one half of a warring world, the other being the Agnians. Noah has an interesting personality type. He has that calm optimism, but is also quite introspective, tending towards empathy, even sometimes at his own detriment. Now, as an Offseer, he plays the flute to honor fallen soldiers. This is an aspect of the game that becomes an intrinsic part of its design, as you'll often be required to see off the spirits of the dead. Now, I won't go into the details as to why he's doing that because that would be a major spoiler, but whether from Keves or Agnes, Noah is always called to do the right thing. Noah's primary weapon is a rather iconic looking blade, and he starts out as an offensive class. Next up, you've got Mio. She's an Agnian Offseer. Mio's almost the mirror image of Noah, not necessarily in personality type, but she'll join Noah off seeing those dead, but is equally empathetic, but she's facing a very real personal struggle that means her focus isn't necessarily on others but rather herself. It's great getting to know what that is, and the character development is excellent and evolves throughout the course of its runtime as they experience some pretty horrific situations. Her weapons are the chakrams. They're very fast and they make her super agile, and she's essentially an evasion tank, absorbing enemy attacks mainly through her own speed and her ability to dodge. Eunie is the Kevesi medic gunner. She carries a rifle staff, and it would be fair to say that she's a little bit sarcastic, a tiny bit blunt, but incredibly loyal. She takes on the role of a medic class, basically healing others, while still doing some offensive damage. Her character arc is particularly interesting. The thing is, with all of these characters, they have their own character quest lines that you can go on to discover exactly where they came from, why they are the way they are. And that's where we get Taion. Taion is an Agnian tactician who has these strange origami-like weapons. He's the very intelligent, quintessential one, but he acts as the overly cautious element to the group, always thinking about what's the most tactically logical move, sometimes forgetting the emotional side. He struggles to trust those around him, so seeing him gradually discover emotive reasons for things rather than simply tactical ones makes up a big part of the runtime. Lanz is possibly my favourite character. He's the Kevesi heavy defender. He carries this massive greatsword that can also transform into a shield, which gave me strong Buster Sword vibes. There's this guy on YouTube that actually makes a lot of the swords from these games and then shows how easy or not they are to swing. This one's going to certainly put your back out. Now, Lanz is the meathead of the group, very physically strong, struggles when dealing with some of the more intellectually developed characters in the group, but perhaps has one of the best senses of right and wrong. He carries a weight of guilt that becomes quite tangible, and it certainly takes its toll on him throughout the experience. SENA is the Agnian attacker. She has this giant hammer. Now, what I like about SENA is that she's the optimistic one, but she's not annoying. They didn't turn her into a slapstick character, which they do in so many games. Instead, she's almost like the little sister role. She looks up to Mio, tends to defer to her, but really struggles with her own self-worth, never feeling like the main character. Hers was another arc that was particularly interesting. It's always good, isn't it, when you get that person that has no self-worth to finally look in the mirror and realize that the person they've been looking at was also the one they've been looking for. And it's That's handled very well here. Now you probably noticed that these 6 characters come from the 2 different sides of that war. I won't go into the circumstances surrounding why that happened, but there's a third party at play within the game, simply introduced as Mobeus.
Can't beat them this time? Won't know until we try.
Before we talk about them, you need to know the origin story. Xenoblade 1's world, which consisted of Bionis and Mechonis, that's what became the foundations for Keves. Xenoblade 2's world, All Rest and Titans, becomes the foundation for Agnes. The 2 worlds don't just merge physically, their laws of physics, their technology, and even their people's souls become intertwined, and the result is Aionios. That's why if you're playing Xenoblade Chronicles 3 but you have played those previous games, you will actually notice locations and landmarks which are straight out of those 2 games. Humanity did have a goal of restoring those previous worlds to their former glory, that is until Mobeus turned up. Let's just say Mobeus require the world to be as it is rather than returned to the way it was. Mobeus are always introduced with a single letter. Again, they're directly linked to Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2. In fact, what a lot of people don't tell you about Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is it actually gives you information on every single character in the game that you meet. At one point you visit a large city called The City, and you'll realise that there's this branching web of every named character that you've met, and a lot of those will actually be descendants of characters that you previously know. People like Monica Vandam being a descendant of Xenoblade 2's Vandam. Thematically, we're looking at themes of free will versus predetermined, but also government systems and inevitably consequence for action. The storyline's just incredibly compelling and it always made sense to me. Now, while I said you don't need to have played the first or second games, certainly there are many references and links for players who have that perhaps would be lost on those who haven't, as this is the final chapter in the Klaus saga. The world of Aionios is divided into multiple regions. Each has its own very distinct landscapes, its own colonies and history. The first of those you'll encounter is a region known as Asia or MEATIER. It's really lush and green, full of fields, forests, a bunch of towering cliffs. In fact, its architecture is actually quite clever, meaning that often you'll be going very high up and crossing over vast chasms, only to sweep underneath through rivers and streams. It's got waterfalls, cliffs, and of course it's got its own colony. This colony is Colony 9 and it belongs to the Kevesi, and that's where Noah, Lanz and Eunie originate from. Also within this region you have Colony Gamma, which is an Agnian colony, the one where Taion originated from. Now, while I don't want to give you specific details about all the other regions because that would just spoil that initial wow moment, every environment type you could think of is covered in Xenoblade 3, from deserts to boggy swamps, strange winding catacombs, and of course snowy peaks. The colonies play a fundamental role in the experience. It's through these that you'll get all of your side quest activities. Colonies are interesting places. On the one hand, I think they're good additions. They give you that constant focus. You've got the side quests that you can carry out. There's like little fetch quests for ingredients and items. You can obviously buy weapons and gear, but on the negative side, they did feel a little bit Ubisoft by the end. You know the Ubisoft tower system where you'd go and do these arbitrary things, unlock an area? It just had a little hint of that. Now that's not fair to Xenoblade, it's done so much better here because a lot of those quests are so individually crafted, but you will still have a lot of the usual gubbins. Go and kill these 3 monsters, go and do this or that, but I guess at least it's properly tied into the storyline rather than simply be, please extend your runtime while we figure out what you do next. The Feronis Hulks are the abandoned outposts that are dotted around the world. They're like deactivated war machines. They're completely ruined, but you can actually reactivate them, which unlocks different resources, shops and a fast travel point. Now, through a combination of colony quests and hero quests, you can actually unlock new playable characters and classes. What's crazy is that these heroes also have their own character backstories, full cinematic storylines for each one, and you'll miss out on some of the best moments if you don't pursue those. A personal favourite has to be Ethel's quest from Colony 4. On its surface, it might look like there's a ton to do, but it's actually a little more limited than you might think. And it's also a little more formulaic as well. It tends to go, arrive at a new colony, carry out a bunch of quests, liberate the colony, move on to the next. Between that though, you've got a world that is delightful to explore. You can climb vines, you can wall run, you're sliding down ropes, almost ice skating across large gaps, and there's a landmark system that will reward you with bonus experience for going and exploring the world. It's often there that you'll also find unique monsters. But that doesn't do justice to any of this because it's missing the special sauce. And that special sauce in Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is the combat.
He's even chunkier than that K guy.
That is a lot of...
At its surface, the combat seems relatively simple. You initiate combat with an enemy, or basically throw a rock at them from a distance so they come and attack you, good for kiting off individuals, and then your characters are all attacking. This is done automatically. You can move them around to different locations, but they'll be swinging that sword or whatever else it is themselves. What you have to do is decide exactly what move you're going to perform and where you're going to perform it. Of course, you can also switch between any of the characters whenever you want. One of your first actions though will be setting the momentum of the group. Are they going to follow your lead? Will they all target the same enemy, hopefully to kill off the hard ones quickly? Or do you want them to do their own thing? Finally, you've got boost attacks, but they don't come in till much later in the game, so you don't really have to worry too much about those at this stage. And all of this is handled with the D-pad. It's just individual button presses, so it's really easy to do while you're still concentrating on the fight. Now, your special abilities, which you can see down here, will very often have a direction of attack. It might be from the side or the rear, and that's how chains are formed. Chains are moves that synergize between your characters. So one could break the enemy, that then allows the next one to stun them, and even the next to topple them. This can leave them massively vulnerable, flailing around on the ground. And while most enemies won't require that, it's a world where your level doesn't affect the level of the creatures in the game, which is great. You can stumble into a level 60 when you're level 5, but equally you can try and take on monsters that are much too strong for you, and with a good use of tactics you can very often succeed. While the levels are indicative of ability, there are also special monsters. If their name's sparkling and glistening, it means they're going to release loads of rewards. If it's blue, it's a stronger, more skillful enemy that's going to give you a big XP boost. But the most interesting by far are the unique enemies. They're essentially bosses, one-of-a-kind named monsters. These fights can be absolutely brutal, but give incredible rewards. The combat system is split between the different classes, many of those initially tied to the character's backstory and traits. But as we'll go into, they're also much more flexible than you might think. You've got the attacker class, high DPS, but within the attacker class you've got subclasses. The sword fighter, which is what Noah is, that's quite balanced. But then later you unlock a character who is the class Full Metal Jaguar, carrying dual pistols and even more. Now, the thing with classes is once you unlock that character through the character quest lines, which as I said were optional, that then unlocks their class for different members of your party to learn. The thing is, certain characters have an affinity for certain classes. So while you could make your starting healer a tank, if they haven't got an affinity, they won't grow in it as well as another. It's such a clever idea and it gives so much freedom. In typical Monolith style, there's also elements that some people will never even use, like master arts. So once you level up a class, you can equip one art from another class. Really handy if you want to take something from, say, a healer and use it for an offensive class. And you'll notice that as you're doing damage to enemies, your arts will gradually charge up and then eventually flash and glow. You'll have arts on both sides of the screen, and by holding a trigger you can actually do fusions using two at the same time, so you could damage and heal in the same move. It's such a clever system, but they also want it to be accessible, so at the side you'll also see a button so that you can actually automatically assign arts and skills based on the class that you've gone for. We've had a few different skill systems over the years. Back in the day my favourite was always the MEATIER system from Final Fantasy VII, but I think Final Fantasy VIII system also had its merits even though people didn't seem to like it. What Xenoblade 3 does is allow you depth if you want it, but not at the cost of pick up and play, something very difficult to achieve. And then they introduce the Oroboros skills. Now I'm not going to tell you what or why the Oroboros occur, but essentially you can Mighty Morphin Power Rangers with another of the characters, which gives them a huge health bar and a bunch of unique skills that do massive damage. You essentially can't die when you're in this form, but you're heavily limited by the fact that it gradually overheats. If you allow it to fully overheat, you won't actually be able to switch back to that form until it's cooled down, which takes quite some time. However, if you manually change just before it overheats, you then don't have to wait for the full cooldown before switching back. The Oroboros forms can be incredibly helpful in a pinch. If your whole team is gradually getting wiped out, switching to make yourself invulnerable or changing to a character that's about to die and doing the same, it can be the difference between success and failure. Now while all of this is going on, quietly ticking away in the corner of the screen is the chain gauge. When this bar fills, that's when you can perform huge chain attacks. This transports you to an entirely new screen where you'll be one-on-one with the enemy. It's a good time to say that my biggest gripe with the game actually is that it doesn't let you continue your chain on another monster. So whichever one's targeted, whether it be a boss or a group of enemies, it will only affect one. Now I'm sure that was by design, but there are times where it would have been nice to be able to either target a group or shift from one to the other. But they did also come up with a clever way of making it never a waste of time to use the chain gauge. So here's how it goes. Depending on who's standing when the chain's activated, their character portraits will be shown. You'll be given 3 options of who starts the chain. Now, depending on who you choose, it will have a specific effect on the chain as a whole. You also only have a number of chain moves before the chain ends. Bear with me, this will make sense. Basically, those little Mighty Morphin Power Ranger moments between the 2 synergized characters known as the Oroboros, well, if you do each of their chain, so the 2 characters that would join together, you then unlock a special Oroboros chain, which is massively damaging. What you're trying to do in this mode is do the most damage, but keep the chain going. You have to get 100 on this little marker here with your characters before the chain is complete and it will go on to the next one. If you don't manage to hit 100, the chain ends. Throw in those optional characters though, and if you're performing their chain, it doesn't cost you any of the overall time shown down here. Look, it sounds simplistic, but it's a beautiful balance of all of the systems that make up the combat, and it means you can do some absolutely outrageous damage by the end of the game. Also, if an enemy dies during, it doesn't mean you have to stop. You can stop if you want, or you can carry on, which is what creates the overkill multipliers. This will then multiply the experience, but also the rewards. That optional overkill is a brilliant idea and very helpful for getting experience from tougher monsters. No combat system is perfect, and by the end of Xenoblade 3, I was certainly feeling a little fatigued. But that's more down to the arc of combat and the frequency, and as with many JRPGs, by the end, you're fighting a lot. The actual nuanced system they've created here I think is brilliant. I'm not entirely sure what they could do to improve upon it, bar the minor quibbles that I've mentioned. For some, automated combat is just never going to be as enjoyable as manually pressing those buttons and manually dodging out of the way. So I do think they could experiment with that, but would it be at the detriment of the overall quality that they've created here? I think it might be. Of course, you can run away from most combat instances as well, but realistically, you won't need to. Unless you skip a lot of the tougher fights, you're going to be more than powerful enough in this. You never really find yourself grinding, and usually you can overcome by switching in and out different skills. The final bosses had me change up my setup multiple times, and isn't that just the best? That's probably the best way it could be, making you use those systems cleverly rather than forcing you to go out and grind to get stronger. Mobeus make up the vast majority of the bosses you'll fight in the game. They have obscene health bars, but some of the best cutscenes tied to their demise. Some of them though do just feel like big sponges as you wail on them for up to half an hour. And the mechanics as a whole, I'm sure you can tell from this review, they could be potentially a little overwhelming for some players. But it's actually the converse of that. The first 10 to 15 hours of the experience, you haven't unlocked half of this stuff and the combat just feels mid. Equally, the class switching mechanics add some real depth to the game, and certainly the hero quests are a brilliant idea for unlocking unique and new classes, but that individual leveling of said classes could be seen as a bit of a grind although I never really felt that way. Finally, it's the balancing between classes. You will soon learn a formula that doesn't require some of the, air quotes, weaker ones at all, and so potential balancing issues do exist within those available, but it's for you to find them. When it comes to the world and the exploration, it's large, it's vast, you've got fast travel between them. It makes no sense to me that the overworld map doesn't show the quest markers on the regions. You have to go into each region and then scan around to find where that marker is. There are lots of accessibility things like an indicator on the ground to show you where to go next if you want it, but there are also a few that aren't in place which you feel possibly should be. The world also doesn't escape from the classic Breath of the Wild syndrome, that is large open spaces with not a great deal to do, as well as things like invisible walls or clear restrictions on the boundaries. Now, I say that because I have to, because I've written it in my notes, but it doesn't feel like that. What it feels like is you've been given this absolutely limitless world to explore, and my goodness is it fun to do so. Personally, I love the fact that your character levels outside of the world and that you do become stronger and stronger. The hero quest options mean there's always somewhere to go to try and find a unique monster, to unlock new skills, and the storyline just ties it all together so well. Certainly, a few of the lines of dialogue throughout the experience weren't great, but the vast majority really were excellent. Now, I do want to briefly mention the DLC of the game as well, because it's actually completely separate in terms of storyline. It acts as a prequel. There are some links to the game, so it doesn't feel pointless, and you see one very quickly, but I'm not going to talk about it. But it gives a good bit of exposition and backstory, which works well once you've completed that mainline narrative. Now, while this isn't a DLC review, they also tweaked the actual mechanics themselves, allowing for a slightly different combat experience. It just blows the mind. Realistically, this 30-hour DLC could be a standalone game. My final negative then of the Xenoblade Chronicles 3 experience were a couple of chapters that just felt stretched. We've seen it done so many times. You might arrive at a location and it's like, okay, twiddle your thumbs for the next 3 days, and then you can proceed. And I was a bit frustrated at a couple of points. It's nothing major, and I've seen far worse, and what they tend to do is hit you with an emotional bomb to kind of make up for it after those moments. Now, while I haven't specifically spoken a great deal about controls, they are as you would expect. You can run around, jump, the actions within combat are all sensible. Gameplay scores 19 out of 20. Controls, they score 18 out of 20. Visually, this is Monolith's finest work. It's also technically incredible. The reason being is we know how low spec the Nintendo Switch is, and realistically was even at launch. So having a world this vast running at 30 FPS, albeit with a dynamic resolution, might not sound too impressive if you're on one of the higher consoles, but knowing what we know, it really is. These games hold up even compared to other platforms, and while the image can become a little blurry at times, artistically they're incredible. The characters by Masasugo Saito are wonderful, so well designed, but I think the real MVP is the world. It's an artistically beautiful place, and unquestionably a technical marvel. It's one of those games that you imagined playing when they first announced the Nintendo Switch. When you saw that trailer for Skyrim and thought, oh my goodness, we're getting real games on a handheld. To be playing this in handheld is just a delight. Xenoblade 3 doesn't slouch in the audio department either. We have work from the iconic Mitsuda, known for Chrono Trigger and Xenogears. It's that familiar emotive pull that in my opinion is far better achieved here than in a series like Dragon Quest. The synergy between audio and visual is far more frequent here. The other composers include Tomori Kudo, Chiko, Kenji Kiramatsu, who worked on a lot of those big moments, Manami Kiyota, and many others who created the game's 142 tracks, including music from the Future Redeemed expansion, and created by Mitsuda's studio. If you're interested in the soundtrack alone, it will come on 9 different CDs. The voice work, obviously, for all the different characters is performed by various actors from across the globe. While a few technical technical issues do mar a couple of moments when it comes to visuals. Certainly the dynamic resolution scaling will bring it down so that it can look a little blurry in certain locations. But alas, audio does have one issue, and that's the overly repetitive loop of a lot of the one-liners the characters do, hence the meme. I think Lanz wants something a little bit meatier.
Hear that, Noah? Lanz wants something a bit meatier. Hear that, Noah? Lanz wants something a bit meatier. 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 Meatier.
It's quite funny the first 72 times, but boy does it begin to grate after that. Still, visuals and performance score 19 out of 20. Sound and audio loses 1 point for that. It gets 19 out of 20 as well. On to value then, you're looking at least 60 to 65 hours if you're just going to focus on the main storyline. I don't really know who does that in a JRPG, and certainly that's not the way I've played. I was going for a completionist run, and then I just was like, no, I want to get onto the DLC. So I think I spent about 80 hours in the game, and then obviously started the DLC expansion. That in and of itself is 20 hours long, but will need to be purchased separately from this. As a standalone experience, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, yeah, it's offering a lot for sure. Of course, there's a physical available as well if you want to go down that avenue. There is a little filler here and there, and I would say the first 10 to 15 hours could have been paced much better. In fact, I would say that's where most of the negative reviews have come from. It's where people have stopped during that time and gone, no, I'm alright, thanks. But they miss out on what is a fantastic experience. There are also some blurrier sections in the visuals. Overall, it's still offering excellent value for money. Value overall then scores 19 out of 20. Xenoblade 3 is an exceptional RPG. While it's certainly not a flawless experience with its slow start and a few more bland areas, it tells an incredible story by the end. Emphasis on the words, by the end. The combat is also outstanding. They found a fine balance between real-time action and turn-based, and I do enjoy the world immensely, but some aspects of its design were a tiny formulaic. As a complete experience though, there aren't many RPGs that do it this well. Xenoblade Chronicles 3, after 2 years and a bit, gets a well-deserved switch-up score of 94%. Thanks to all of you that enjoy the content. If you like that one, let me know down below. You can tell me that I'm completely wrong, that's fine. And I'm certainly looking forward to what they can do on Switch 2 hardware. It's going to be insane. For all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys, see ya!